Okay, so it's 1 p.m., at least on Eastern time, so top of the hour. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending this session, an overview of notices for local admins. If you're looking for the other session, that will be in track 2. Just click on sessions on the left-hand side, and then you'll get to the right place from there. So today we have Rogan and Steve coming in from Equinox. Thank you very much for giving us some time to talk about this. And I just want to mention a couple of things before we get started. So first and foremost, we're doing the sponsorships a little bit different this year. We have some champion level sponsors we'd like to thank before we start. ECDI, the Collaborative Development Initiative, Equinox, Unique Management, Midwest Tape, and Stat Courier. We also have a little bit of a difference this time around too, where the captions are actually going to be embedded within the Ring Central event. So if you go to the right-hand side, it's going to say session, chat, and then captions all the way on the right next to Q&A. You can click on that for some captions, and you can see that's actually starting to get going there. So that's kind of nice. I'm Gina. I'm going to be moderating this session. So if you have any questions, please put it in chat. And then whenever we have some breaks, I'll make sure the presenters get to it. So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Okay, I will take over sharing. This worked when we tested it a minute ago, so hopefully it will again. There we go. So today we're going to talk about how notices work. Notices are a subset of action triggers. We're not going to go into everything that can be done with action triggers. Even just, although there was a presentation last year, it's available on our community YouTube channel about other things that can be done with action triggers. But we're going to focus on notices. And honestly, we're not going to go into every possibility because even just the subset of notices, we could easily do a half day, full day on. And we only have a few hours. But we are going to give you a good and solid introduction if there are spots in your knowledge of what it takes to make notices work in Evergreen. Myself, I'm Rogan Hamby. I'm the data and project manager here at Equinox, which is a fancy way of saying that I take data from old products, usually ILSs, and get them to work in Evergreen and Koha. And along the way, I set up a lot of notices. But I certainly don't know everything. And the person I tend to rely on the most when I have questions or need an extra set of eyes is Steve. So we'll let Steve introduce himself. I think you're muted, Steve.
Yes, hi, I'm Stephen Callender. I work also with Equinox. I'm the help desk manager here, and I recognize some of the names out there. I'm sure I've worked with some of you in the past on probably notices as well, and I'm pretty familiar with notices. I've been working with them now for the last 10 plus years since they were first created into Evergreen, and so I'm excited to talk to you about them today. They're a very complicated thing, but they don't have to be. They could be a more basic, simple level too. It depends on how crazy you want to get with them. So hopefully we'll get through some of that today and make you a little more comfortable with them.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk all about notices. To follow up on what Steve said a little bit, I do think that the way notices work in Evergreen have a fairly high learning curve. But once you kind of hit a certain point in them, and this was certainly the case for me, there was a long time early in my time with Evergreen where I just did not really understand notices. I mean, I understood this part or that part, and I understood some of the big picture, but I didn't really get it. And at some point, something clicked. And I think that's true for everybody, that once you pass a certain point in the learning curve, it just starts to make more sense for you. So that's what we're going to try to do today is we're going to try to outline all those components that you need to make it make sense. Now, we may skim over a few things because we don't have, 6 hours, but we are going to hit all the critical points and try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. And first up, we just want to talk about action triggers. When we talk about notices, what we're really talking about is a subset of action triggers. And these are what I think of as the critical parts of an action trigger for you to learn up front. The hook, the validator, the reactor, delay, max delay, opt-in settings, template, granularity, group field, and messages. There are more fields on that table, more things you can configure, but and some of them you will need to configure, don't get me wrong, but these are what I think you need conceptually to understand. And we're going to go into all of these in more depth as we go along. And this is basically how I think of action triggers as working. If you want to think about setting one up for a notice, first think about the hook. The hook is the condition that starts the notice. Like, is an item overdue? Is an item waiting for pickup on the hold shelf? And then you look to see if you have a hook that works for that function. If there's not one existing in the system, well, then that becomes a development issue, which we're not going to go into today. But that's the first part. Ask if there's a hook that you can use for the condition for what you want to respond to with a notice. And then you need a reactor and a validation. The reactor is basically process a template, send an email, send an SMS through a gateway. And a validation is this still a valid notice to send? We'll go into all that in some more detail. And then the action trigger has to actually gather that information and put it somewhere. It's in its own little subtable under the action trigger schema. And then you send the notices out. So that is really big picture. I'm going to go ahead and do my first pause and ask if anybody has questions about that. I don't see chat blowing up, so I'm going to hope that's fairly straightforward so far. I will also mention, feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. Gina already mentioned that she'll make sure we have the questions during breaks. I will also try to monitor chat, and I don't mind answering questions as we go at all. I don't like it when people forget questions because they hold them in. So please go ahead and post them. And we will probably take a break when we get near to the hour mark. So let's go on and talk about hooks. I think, Steve, you were doing this one?
Yeah. Okay. Hooks can be categorized as two main types of hooks. There's passive and there's non-passive. Non-passive you might also call active. You can determine the type by going into the action triggers area of the system in the administration, local administration, notifications, action triggers settings in the menu. At the top of the screen, you can see an example here. There are folder tabs that have the event definitions, hooks, reactors, and validators listed. If you click on the hooks, it's going to show you all the hooks that you have access to and lay out the instructions for how a trigger functions along whether it's a passive or non-passive trigger. Now, a non-passive trigger is a hook that will fire off based on an action taken in the Evergreen staff client. So if you want to click to the next slide, Rogan.
Sure. Trying to. There we go.
So I've listed a few of the more common types here, the common ones here. Actions such as checking in or checking out an item, marking an item as damaged, or when a hold is captured for a patron. All these actions have code built directly into Evergreen that are using the corresponding hook. They all have code built directly into Evergreen to look for any triggers that are using that hook, and immediately fires them off. So those lists listed at the top there, when you do something in Evergreen built directly into the code, it says to every trigger that has this hook attached to it, fire it off. This is what we're looking for. Now, passive triggers are not fired off when an action takes place on the system. Instead, the data is already in the database, and the hook relies on a set of instructions telling it how to find that data. Things like an item is almost due for like your courtesy notices, pre-dues, or if an item is overdue, there's nothing on the system that causes this event to happen other than just the simple passing of time. It's up to the instructions we put on the trigger itself, on the hook, to tell what events qualify for this. And I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation.
And so once you have hooks, you have to talk about reactors. If the hook is what is going to trigger an action trigger a notice, then the reactor is what is Evergreen going to do in response to that hook afterwards. And there's a whole bunch of reactors in the system. I'm not listing them all here. I'm listing them primarily for those relevant for notices. And there's one here you may not expect for notices, and we'll get to that last in the list. The first one is process template. Process template simply says, take the field that's called template and run it. This could be as simple if we were, using the old programming example as typing hello world in there. That's not going to be very useful because nobody needs a notice that just says hello world. So we also can apply some logic and pull values from the database, which we'll talk more about in the template section, using something called Template Toolkit and pulling values through environments and all kinds of other stuff. But that will produce output of data. Now, send email is basically process template. You can do all those same things you do with process template, but it will also send it through a configured email system. And I think that's fairly self-explanatory for everyone. And then send SMS is process template plus sending it through a configured SMS gateway using an SMS carrier. Now, this last one, nope, true. This one's a little different because this one is always going to say true. That's all it does as a reactor. It says that this action trigger event has happened. And we use this with some external notification systems, where, such as the scripts that the community uses for MessageBee, where we use the action triggers to track what notices should be generated for what events, but then an external script is actually compiling the information and sending the files off to the partner agency. Any questions about any of that? I will say, if you want to get into reactors, there are some really neat reactors that do other things, but that's getting a little out in the weeds for notices. Now, validators. It's really important to have validators, because what happens if, say, you check in a whole bunch of holds at 8 a.m. and then you send off hold notices 2 hours later? What if a bunch of them have already been picked up? You're sending out unnecessary holds notices that can confuse people. So it's important to make sure they're still valid when they're sent. And that is exactly what the validator does. The validator, for example, for a holds notice will say, check to see if that hold is still on the shelf waiting for pickup. If sending an overdue notice, check to see if the item is still overdue and hasn't been checked in yet. Those sorts of things. Now, it is important to say that this is when the notice is generated. It does not check after the fact. This is one of the most common questions I get. If it sends the email for an overdue notice at 2 in the afternoon and they don't check their email until 6 p.m., obviously things could have changed in those 4 hours and nothing Evergreen can do about that. It's not going to check and retrieve the email after it sent it to make sure that the condition is still there. And of course, that sort of time lapse is even more true for print notices, especially if your library doesn't actually process those print notices every day. If the print notice generated 2 days ago and you're just now processing them, it could certainly be out of date. But at the time it generated, it was valid. And that gets into delays and max delays a little bit. And I'll pause for questions after this if anybody has questions. I realize as I look at the screen that there's maybe a generational joke some of the younger folks here don't get about a film. But when I think about delays and max delays and how to explain them, I think about a situation I ran into many years ago where a library said, we really don't want our hold notices to go out right away. And I said, why? You want them to be timely, of course. And they said, we have problems where we're still processing holds and they're sitting on a cart before they get to the shelf, and patrons are coming in to pick up their hold because they got a notice almost immediately. And we're looking for them on the shelf when they're actually on the cart. And then staff go to the cart and then they're rummaging through the cart, and that's interfering with the people putting them on the cart, and it's chaos. And that sort of scenario is what a delay is for. And a hold notice is probably one of the most common for this, where you put on a 15 or 30-minute delay to give staff time to process the materials before the notice goes out. A max delay will also say how long can pass before it no longer attempts to send it. All right. Any questions at this point about anything, delays, reactors, validators? I'm giving people just a moment, but it looks like this is fairly straightforward for folks. Can you, Elizabeth Davis asks, can you build or add new hooks? You can. That is a development matter, but you definitely can. I have done it before. I have worked with libraries that wanted customizations. It is, I am speaking with my Evergreen community hat saying that. Obviously, if you're in a hosted situation, it's something you'll want to talk with your hosting provider about. If it's a hook that's useful for everybody, though, that'd be a great thing to add to Launchpad. Absolutely. But yes, new hooks can be written. I've done it before. Do you have an example of when you would use a max delay? Sure. Very commonly, for example, with overdue notices, I will set up a max delay so that a second overdue notice doesn't generate when a third overdue notice is ready to generate. So let's say a library sends a second overdue at 14 days and then a third overdue at 21 days. I'll put a max delay on so that that max delay for the second one ends before the third one starts. Because if something really horrible happened, which I've never had anything go this bad, but let's say something did happen and nobody noticed right away over a long holiday or something, there's no point in generating a second and third at the same time. We might as well put a max delay to time the second one out. Do you have any other thoughts about that particular question about using a max delay, Steve? You may have some other perspectives from support.
No, that pretty much covers it. We want to use a max delay just in case there was a problem sending out notices, so we don't just swarm a patron with a bunch of, this is 7 days overdue, and also this is 14 days overdue, because that could get confusing. So we typically go about a 3-day window. Pre-dues as well. If you have a delay of a -3 days, which will tell it to, we want this notice to go out 3 days before the item is due. We want to put maybe a max delay on there of -1 days, just so if something happened and that notice wasn't able to go out and it all of a sudden becomes the day the item is due, we don't want the patron to get a notice saying your item is due in 3 days when it's actually due that day. So that's what we use. It's mostly the max delays are mostly used to safeguard in case there was any problems happening with the trigger process itself and email couldn't go out.
Yeah, and that's a good point that I didn't think to say that they are a safeguard. Absolutely agree. Nicole asked, where can we find our current hold notification delay times? You can find them in the action triggers / notices of local administration screen and the staff client of Evergreen. If you open up the definition of one of your action triggers, it will list it there. And I believe it is labeled delay and max delay. It's not particularly cryptic. Oh, and Jeremy's is explaining that as well. All right. Keep questions coming. I think you did a better job typing that at speed than I would have, Jeremy. So opt-in. What to say about opting in? Opting in is exactly what it sounds like. It is the ability to say that a setting has been set for the user that says they will allow sending that kind of notification. Now, it is important to point out that these have to be a valid actor setting or patron setting, so to speak. And while those can be made up, there is a certain barrier in that if front-end staff can't set them somewhere like patron registration or patron editing, they're not going to be horribly useful in most scenarios. But so long as the setting does exist, you can use it in the opt-in settings. And I should specify it has to be a Boolean setting, that you can use it in the opt-in setting field for action triggers to say, in addition to the other criteria, such as this item is overdue, they also have this setting set to say they're willing to receive this kind of notice. I will say that Evergreen's options for this are fairly limited right now. And one of the things I would love to see happen in the future is somebody pick up the banner for more granular and robust opt-in settings. Now, with that said, you don't always necessarily want opt-in settings. For example, I have worked with libraries, with municipalities, where there are also laws on the books about returning library materials, and patrons do not get to opt out of receiving certain notifications. So it is optional to use these. And I will note that sending email checkout receipts, I know we don't always think about checkout receipts as a notification. I kind of do. I think of it as a form of notification, and it is probably the single most commonly set that I see. Default SMS notify is certainly one as well. Oh, and I'll also say for default SMS notify, there are a few other ones as well that are fairly common. But if you use an external service to send SMS messages, they will usually require that this be set as a part of privacy policies set by the agency that authorizes SMS campaigns. They have to approve that certain things are being done privacy-wise for true SMS messaging, including that patrons have opted in to receiving those messages. Now, messages. Messages in a slightly different sense than, say, SMS messages. I find a lot of libraries don't use these, especially because they think they can be confusing at times. So what is a message? Actually, first, let me kind of poll people in chat very quickly. How many people here use action trigger messages? I'm going to guess not many. Taryn does. Kevin uses SMS. Now, SMS isn't a message in this sense. Well, SMS is very problematic, but that's another issue. The SMS gateways. No, but still curious. Okay. I'm going to take a quick detour very quickly, if you'll indulge me, because Kevin was bringing up SMS. I'm not talking about SMS messages here. SMS is problematic. SMS, frankly, because Evergreen uses email gateway system, which is an old sort of on your honor system of the internet, it is slowly dying. For example, AT&T announced recently that I believe in June, they will no longer operate their SMS gateway at all. And others have severely throttled theirs. Teresa says June 17th. That sounds right to me. Thank you, Teresa. And frankly, they'll bounce stuff without hesitation. I believe this is because they see SMS gateways as an expense and not something of value for their companies. So yes, this is why external SMS services have grown in popularity. But in this case, for this slide, I'm not talking about SMS messages. I am talking about Evergreen messages, internal Evergreen messages, hence the cat meme. This is my obligatory cat picture for the presentation about staying home. This is a sort of notice that doesn't leave the system. It doesn't go out by email, doesn't get printed and mailed anywhere. It doesn't go out as an SMS message. It stays internal to Evergreen and is viewable by the patron in the OPAC. And action triggers can both generate an external template output as well as an internal message on the same action trigger. I find that libraries generally don't do this, and a lot of libraries aren't even aware of them because they don't want to do them on the same action triggers a lot of time because they don't want to send double notices and confuse patrons. However, if you have something that doesn't need an external message sent, but makes sense for people to only see if they log into the OPAC, they're absolutely usable for that. Joni says, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Joni. If not, feel free to correct me. We use them when we can't get in touch with patrons through other channels. Yep. Use them for long overdue build items, says Michelle. Yep. I actually kind of like messages. I find they're not popular and a lot of people aren't aware of them. But I actually kind of wish people used them more, but I like the idea of sending messages through all possible channels. But that's just me personally. Now, templates. Templates are kind of the part that gets a little bit more fun in action triggers notices to me. Templates are what you create when you create content, whether it's plain text, HTML, XML, whatever you want to make. You could have a template that makes Markdown for you if you want. If you hate yourself on a spiritual level, you could try to create one that produces latex content. For those not familiar with latex, it's a very old but very powerful text formatting language. And the idea of implementing it through action triggers sounds like an absolute nightmare to me, but theoretically doable. And this is an example of some content in templates. Now, we create templates generally to either produce stuff that is plain text with some database values filled in, or XML. And these two are largely equivalent for those purposes. At the top, we have an example like we might use in an email where we're generating plain text. Dear, first name, last name, thank you for being a great library user. And it's plain text except those little template toolkit codes that pull in the information for the first and last name. And then the second line, the last line, I should say, is doing the same thing, except we're grabbing the first name for an XML field, like we would process to create a print notice usually. Now, I mentioned on the previous slide, you don't have to do XML. If you wanted to do a workflow with ASCII doc or Markdown or some other markup language, you could certainly do that. HTML. XML tends to be pretty convenient, though, especially for the rest of the workflow, which we'll talk about later, that a lot of the Evergreen community uses for the print notices. And then there are helper functions. There are certainly more helper functions than these, some of them specialized for things like acquisition line items and stuff like that. But I feel like the two you must know and should go ahead and learn right away are helpers.getOrgSetting. It takes a library ID and then a name of a setting and retrieves the value of it. And then helpers.escape.xml to take values in your database that as raw text may not be valid XML values for print notices and makes them valid. There are also some functions you can use that you inherit from Template Toolkit, like the .trim here. And I'll provide a link along the way for Template Toolkit, but if that's a term you don't know, they have their own website. I believe it's templatetoolkit.org. You can certainly use your search engine of choice to search for Template Toolkit and you'll find it. And the Template Toolkit also allows for you to do logic, such as this very simple command structure. If circ.user.firstgivenname equals Rogan, it's cool, man. Turn it back in when it makes you happy. Else, your item is overdue. The library police are en route now. Oh, and I did provide the link here, template-toolkit.org. In fact, Template Toolkit is robust enough that they also have else if statement, so you can have multiple levels of conditioning. You can do a whole bunch of stuff. In fact, one of the things I'm most often surprised about is libraries that maintain a lot of different templates just to change some basic wording when they could do that in one notice and maintain it with if-else statements. I went through a lot of stuff in a short space there, so I want to open it up for questions again. Yeah, Kevin, don't mess with the library police. They can put you in dusty, moldy rooms. Your lungs will never recover. Taryn says they do a lot of if-elsing for different patron types. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great use for it. And I'm sure there are some great tricks out there. I just realized I did not check the wiki before this, but I would not be surprised if there aren't some great tips and tricks for template toolkit notices on the wiki. If not, we should probably start one. Any additional thoughts to all of that, Steve? I know you play around with some tricks too.
Yeah, no additional thoughts. I talk a little bit about if statements later on. So,
Okay.
but no, I think if statements are a great way to go in notices to kind of keep it so you don't have to break out into 50 different notices of the same kind, and you can use if statements instead. So I think that's a.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And you will make your life easier the fewer notices you have to maintain. Maintaining some if else statements, way easier than maintaining separate notices. I promise you. And you will also make whoever runs your servers happy because that means a lot less to keep track of when things have to be done with manually running triggers on the back end and all that jazz. And if you're hosted by Equinox, Steve will thank you for fewer notices.
Indeed.
Oh, and a little trick. I actually just learned this recently. Steve is actually the one that explained it to me. I went a long time without knowing this, so I'm going to thank him here. But for a long time, I had noticed that some template toolkit tags had this little dash before or after, and others didn't. Some only had it on one side and not the other. And do you want to explain to folks what that is, Steve? You explained it to me, so I think you should explain it.
Yeah, what that does is it backs up a line. So what you see at that bottom part where you have the percentage is going to tell it that we're entering template toolkit code here. So what that's going to do, that bottom with those two minuses, it's going to make it an invisible line. So let's say on your notice you had that maybe a logic check there, an if statement there. If you did not have those minuses there, it's going to treat that if statement as a blank line in your notice. So it's going to start spacing your notice an extra line there, and it's not going to have anything in it because it's just some logic. In this particular case, you have a user family name. It's going to back up to the previous line because of those minuses in it. This is good for like in an email header and top of in the notices, the email header. Now, email, when you're sending an email over to the SMTP server, it's very specific on how that header has to look. It has to have a to field, a from field, a subject field, a date field, and all those have to be on their own line with no spaces in between. So if you were to not have the minuses in there with your logic at the top, it's going to put spaces in there for it. It just backs up. It backs up. Does it back up? Just one line.
Only one line, I believe.
Yeah, it'll back up a line. That's for the front and the end. So when we want invisible code in the notice, we want to use those minuses. And that's very important, or you can have a really spacey notice. So that's what that does.
Yeah. And this is a good example of something very small that it's easy to miss. And if you're starting to work with action triggers by copying existing ones, you can do so successfully without knowing exactly why everything works. But you can certainly learn it later. Now, parameters. I find that people are often confused about what parameters are, and I actually think they're one of the easiest things to conceptually understand, even if it's not always easy to find a place to use them. And indeed, if you go in and look at your action triggers, go into local administration, click on notices action triggers, and start clicking on the individual ones and opening the tabs for parameters, you will find a lot of notices do not have parameters. And that's okay. But I wanted to give you a few examples here of some that do use parameters. For example, there's a parameter called editor. You could have one called creator. And these are for action triggers that actually need to set a editor or a creator and pass it to the reactor that does that. The example that pops to the top of my head is not a notice, which is why I put that in the slide, but it is marked lost. When an item is marked lost, it has to have somebody mark it lost, be the editor. So the marked lost action trigger has a parameter. And in our case, we usually use one, which is an administrative account, to make it clear it was an administrator that did it automatically. But you could, have a marked lost staff account and use that, for example. Oh, Stephanie is providing a hint, a little suggestion in chat. There is another version with a tilde that removes all white space before it. Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. That is good to know. Yes, white space is a pain. Thank you for that, Stephanie. Another example of value of parameters. This is actually, I'm going to again reference the message B external scripts. Message B sets a parameter of XML notice last processed ID to track which was the last action trigger process in a notice sent out for, and stores that data in a parameter of the action trigger. Stephanie says there's yet another with an equal sign. We won't get into all that, but Stephanie has a great link there. For those listening along with this, I will say it is template-toolkit.org/docs/manual/C config.html. And yes, the template toolkit docs are invaluable. Although if you're like me, you tend to be more of a run into a situation, read the docs to solve that problem type person, rather than a read and learn them comprehensively. Next, I want to talk about data and environments a little bit. One of the things you can do with Template Toolkit is basically assign variables. For those who've never done any coding, a variable is just something where you give an arbitrary name to assign stuff to. So, for example, the object, the sort of core object of a notice is usually the target. Say the hold, the circulation, the whatever it is. A hold for a hold notice, a circulation for a circ notice, a user for an account expiration notice. And then you can refer to values off it. So, for example, for a circulation, target.user. That is the ID of the user. That is has checked the item out. But it may be useful in your notices, and this is very common in a lot of notices I work with, to assign that value to a variable to make it easier to reference. So in this example, we have said the target user, USR, is user, USER. And later in the template, we can say user.firstgivenname, which is literally in the database actor.user field firstgivenname. However, I put as a little equal sign here. If we were to say target.user.firstgivenname, that would be equivalent. If we hadn't declared user equals target.user, we could say that instead. But it allows us to take longer paths and shorten them and make them easier to work with. And we can jump off other values for that, such as user.card.barcode, to jump over to a patron's barcode value. Any questions about all that? Well, people are... Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, rather than think of it as an ID, that helps me. You see at the top of the user equals target user, I think of it as the user objects being attached to user. So then we have access to all the data within the user object,
Right.
which would be first given name, family name, expire date, anything you want to access that's part of the user object you can do. And then below that, where we see user, where that's now the user object, we're attaching the card object to that. So now we have access to the user card barcode, we have the user card valid, and everything that's as part of the card object. So we're just kind of creating a variable that's an object of the item. So.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a place where some knowledge of the database is useful, just to be honest. Knowing what fields exist off the card table, knowing what fields exist off the user table is pretty darn useful. Jeremy asked, the last one has no equal sign. I was just showing this as an example of jumping to a different table or a different object, depending on how you want to think about it. You could write it out equal target.user.card.barcode if you weren't using that variable assignment up front. It's just an illustration of jumping to another table. Now, that also brings us to an issue before we talk about environments, which is what data is brought in initially on these objects. And the answer is, I don't have a definitive reference source for you for that. There is certain data kind of automatically available with each of these targets in these objects. Okay, Taryn says, that's always been one of my pet peeves, the lack of easy reference for what the initially supplied objects are. Is that what you're referring to, Taryn? Yes. Yeah, I'm right there with you. That is, it still bites me every now and then, even though I'm pretty darn used to it. It still is occasionally like, really? That's not automatically available in this? And when you go to do something like user.card, well, user card isn't a good example, but let's say you do a more involved join over to something that's not initially available as part of the target object. That is how you get errors. And that is one of those cases where you may generate output. When we're going to talk more about this in troubleshooting later, but if you ever end up opening OpenSurf logs because your templates are empty, your output is empty, and it says there is no such object available, it's probably not available in the initial target. And that is where environments come in. Environments allow you to go beyond what is initially defined. And again, this is available on one of those tabs. When you go into local administration, notifications, action triggers, open up one of the individual action triggers. And I mentioned parameters earlier. Environment is one of those tabs also. Now, you may have some with no environments. You may have some like, say, overdue notices, which is what this is from, that has a whole bunch of them. And this is a way of moving beyond those initial objects supplied and pulling in more objects, which it has to do. Well, I'm not going to get into right now the steps of all the potential steps of an action trigger, but there is a step called collected, where it has to gather up all the objects and gather the information for the notice. And so that's why it needs these environments defined up front to know what it has to pull in. And for example, for an overdue notice, the billing address and mailing address are not automatically with the circulation. You have to tell it, I'm going to want to use these in my notice. There's information from the target copy, such as that connects through the target copy, like the call number and the location. Now, target copy is automatically pulled in. You can use stuff from the copy, but it doesn't automatically pull in the location from the target copy or the call number. So this is going to pull in those connecting objects. Does that make sense? I'm giving folks just a moment to let this sink in. I find this is sometimes one of the last things for people to sort of comprehensively get as they work with action triggers, is the role that environments play. Steve points out in chat, you can use, if you look at a source copy, you can look at the field mapper IDL XML file. Absolutely. Yep. And if you are a SQL user and you're used to looking at the database, you kind of have a head start on it already. Jeremy asks, so we don't know what things are automatically pulled in, but if we run into something that isn't, we can pull it in with environment. Yes, absolutely. And my general rule of thumb is that this is not, don't take this as gospel. My general rule of thumb is that one object away, a lot of things are pulled in. If it starts getting two away, two connections away, I'm probably going to have to set an environment for it. That's not gospel, it's not universal, but to use examples here, if you're, this is an overdue, so the base object is a circulation, it's going to pull in the circulation library automatically. I can, without an environment, call for the circulating library's name. But to get that circulating library's mailing address, which is one more connection away, I'm going to have to set that in the environment. So Jeremy, to put it in SQL terms, one join over is good, two gets iffy. Yes. Again, this is not universal, but it's a, as I was learning action triggers, it was a rule of thumb that helped me more often than not. I do have a long-standing desire to sit down and actually document these. That is somewhere on my list, along with a whole bunch of things I've never gotten around to. Two over almost certainly needs an environment, Jeremy. Yeah. And as Taryn says, making friends with the field mapper is a good start to any project. Yeah. If you're going to dig into guts of Evergreen, just get used to knowing the field mapper. Absolutely. All right. Group fields. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here because I think the concept is fairly straightforward, but just to make sure everyone knows. A group field is something you define in an action trigger to literally group events together. So let's say somebody has 5 overdues to prevent the system from sending out 5 separate emails, but instead to make an array of objects, a list of objects that can say all 5 of those overdues that can be processed together and iterated through as a list to put all those overdues in one email. We say that the user is the group field, so that something that has a common reactor and common validator based on that group field, such as user, so overdues that are still overdue and not checked in by that user that are processing together, can all be grouped together for one notice. And Steve points out, for reference, circulations start at class ID circ. Yep. And and just to note, if you have not ever looked at the field mapper, you can open up the field mapper with a text editor and just do text searches in something like Notepad++ or TextMate or whatever you like to use, and search for what you want. If you know the database tables, that's great. But even if you have no experience with the database, you've never looked at field mapper before, just doing some searches for keywords that you would expect, like circulation, and a little bit of patience will find you what you want. And as you do that, you will start developing comfort with finding stuff in the field mapper really quickly. And Jason Stevenson says, if you know the database table, you can find the objects that way. Yeah, that's a super fast way. Then you can just look for action.circulation and boom, you're there. But even if you just look for the word circulation, you may hit some false positives, but you will find it. Steve says, the good thing is looking at the hooks in the menu, it tells you what the starting class is for that hook. Absolutely. Eli said, what a slide to come in on. You're welcome. Yes. And Jason, following up on Steve's comment, says the object is the core type on the hook. I apologize for anybody who doesn't like me reading the messages, but for people who are more auditory and not reading, I want to make sure that they don't lose this content. Okay. We are at the 10-minute mark to the hour, and I think we're right on schedule for finishing up some slides and having time for Q&A. Do folks want a 5-minute break for those who need to refresh coffee or anything else? Let's do 5 minutes. We will start again 5 minutes from now. I'm not going anywhere. I will sit here and chat, but I hate to make people with an urgent need or anything like that not able to go to the restroom or something. And Michelle Morgan has pointed out that you can find your field mapper file by going to your host name of your server /reports /lowercase fm, as in Fox Mary, underscore uppercase IDL, as in interface definition language, dot lowercase XML. Jason, I did not specifically mention that they're usually grouped on the user field. I did mention that many are, but yes, they are usually grouped on the user field. This is usually what makes sense, of course, because that's who we're sending the notice to. Yeah. In fact, I'm trying to think if there's any other, for notices at least, group field that would make sense. And I can't think of one off the top of my head. Stephanie mentions that the new devs docs on the field mapper are incomplete but might be helpful. Those live on the Evergreen wiki. I am not going to read that whole link, but if you go to wiki.evergreen-ils.org, you can just search for new devs and find it pretty quickly. Taryn says that when they did their first, I assume you use she, her pronouns, so if I'm incorrect, apologize. But Taryn says that when she first did Action Trigger Project 11 or 12 years ago, all she had access to was the field mapper link and managed to get it done, but the interface indicating the starting class would be nice. Yeah. There's no doubt that notices in Evergreen have a learning curve. I think once you get used to them, they really do make sense, but I know that many people find that learning curve pretty steep. And that's partially why we're here, to demystify some of it. Jason Stevenson, we need to document filters. Yes, we do. Yes. Kevin says, I like notices in Evergreen. Oh, absolutely. It's a great infrastructure. You have to make design decisions about features. You always have to. And the design decision of Evergreen was to give users power. But that comes with a price of that power, and flexibility means a learning curve. I'm glad this is good for you, Taryn. This is exactly why we're doing this, Taryn. Want to try to make things a little more transparent for folks. And I will say a little bit of it is perhaps selfish from my standpoint as somebody who does a lot of migrations, because I work with a lot of folks that want to learn about how to do more with their own notices and migrations. And I usually hit a point where I say, we really don't have time for that right now, as politely as I can. And having this will be useful to tell people they can go watch this for an introduction to Action Trigger notices. All right. It is 5 after. Hopefully, everyone is taking care of updating their caffeine or whatever they need to do. And I'm going to pass it back over to Steve to talk about chronologies, not serials chronology, a different kind.
Yes, cron stuff. Now, a lot of the next few things I'm going to talk about it requires more back end access to the server. These are things that aren't going to really be able to be done on the front end screens. You're going to need access to cron on the back end, the scheduler, and you're going to need access to the file structure. And I'll get to that in a second. So cron, it's a time-based job scheduler in Linux. It allows users to automate the execution of scripts at specific time or intervals. Now, Evergreen has a few of scripts that run through cron. One is the hold targeter, usually runs every 15 minutes looking for items to fulfill holds. Another one's a fine generator. It's going to run at least once every morning to apply fines to overdue circulations. In this case, however, I'm talking about the process that runs the action triggers. Action triggers have a field on them called granularity. This field is used in order to isolate or group your triggers and have them run at a specific time of day. This is great for doing things like sending emails or SMS messages only during business hours so you don't wake your patrons up in the middle of the night. We've had a few of those kind of complaints. You could also use it to separate your events so that you can do something like have all your overdue notices go out first and then secondary follow up with all your pre-due notices. It's so you don't have to do everything at once. You can get everything fired off, because if you're doing typically folks are going to have a lot more pre-dues than there are overdues, and so you want to just get the overdues out and not have them have to wait on the pre-dues. Let's get the overdues out, and so they're in the patrons email boxes right away, and then work on the pre-dues a little bit later in the day. You want to switch to the next slide, Rogan, for me?
Oh, absolutely.
So here, I'm going to show you some standard cron entries for the action triggers. At the very top is the master trigger running script that we can see runs every 2 minutes. In this example, there's no granularity on this one. It will simply look for triggers that have no granularity and are in the database under a pending state. This will mostly be our non-passive triggers that were ran based on a system action. Now below that, you can see in the example, there are some that run every hour, once a week, once a month, among other ones. So next slide. Now, here's more examples of a little bit more fine-tuned entries. The overdues and the pre-dues are separated, given the lost notice is their own running, and I'm sending SMS messages daily between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. So there's an example of how to do that. So we don't we alert the patrons' phones will beep at a better time for them. Now, all these granularities also have to be on the corresponding granularity field on the action trigger setup menu for it to work. Every granularity that is used in our action triggers must have a cron entry telling it how and when to run. So basically, you can make a granularity at any name you want to use on the menu screen, but you also have to tell it behind the system in your cron scheduler that we're going to run that specific granularity. Otherwise, it'll just sit there and nothing will ever happen to it. Next slide, Rogan.
Sure. I will throw in real quick. Also, be careful of things like putting in invisible spaces or tabs you don't see.
Yes.
Just
Now, the action trigger runner script allows for a number of parameters. Here's some of the most popular ones. You'll see that all of these examples have process hooks in them. That's because we want it to process the hook and go and make the notices. So that's an important one to have in there. Since we're mostly dealing with passive triggers when we're running these, we have to process all the hooks for that trigger. Non-passive triggers, however, will have the hooks that are already processed, and the events will be sitting in the database under a pending status. This brings me to the next parameter. Just like non-passive, when the hooks are processed on passive, they also go into a pending state. The first part of having the event written into the database is finished. We have to tell the system to go through and run all the events that are sitting there as pending. So as Rogan alluded to a little bit ago, there's multiple stages for the triggers, but the most important ones we're concerned with is they go to pending, and then we grab the pending and they go to completed. The granularities we've already gone through. You'll notice there's another parameter for granularity only. You'll see that on the you'll see in my previous example. You see it on there, but I've listed it here. So when you use the granularity only parameter on your action trigger runner, it tells the trigger to only worry about the items that are using that specific granularity. We just want to use that. We don't want it to venture out and find all the other pending items. We just want to use the ones that are using the granularity we mentioned, because we have other triggers taking care of everything else. So now, since sometimes we can have a trigger that might fire off every 2 minutes, like in our example, the script creates a lock file on the server to block any duplicate running of that same trigger at the same time. So if it's running every 2 minutes, and let's say it has a heavy workload at the moment, it's going to take 10 minutes to process all those notices. We don't want a second one firing off at the same time and finding the same stuff. And now you got 2 working on it, pretty soon you got 3. So what the system does is it will create a lock file, and the lock file sits there on the server until it's finished, telling it, if I'm running again and I see this lock file, just wait for me to finish, and then when I'm done, you can then look for your stuff to do. Now, you can specify a specific name for the lock file if you want to. Otherwise, it's going to use a custom name. The custom name usually grabs from your granularity and tacks on what it's doing. So it just makes a custom lock file. But if you want to be more organized, you can actually name it any name you want to. The next parameter is the custom filter parameter, and I'll get to that in just one second. The last 2 are debugging parameters you can use if you're running your action trigger to spit some details out on the screen if you're trying to figure out why a trigger doesn't work. I think it'll tell you what it's doing in the database, what it's looking for, and you can use that to troubleshoot a broken trigger. So next slide. Now we're going to get to the filters. Now, each trigger can have a special filter used when running it. Custom filters are a way to modify the normal stock rules that tells Evergreen how to process each hook. For example, you might want your DVDs to be marked as lost earlier than the books go to lost. You might want to send an email out to just users that checked out items in a certain circulation modifier, or you might want a specific email to go out for patrons under a specific patron profile. That's what a custom filter is capable of doing. So on the next slide, I'll give some examples of that. So filters are created in a JSON file. JSON is JavaScript object notation. This is data format used for exchanging data. In the stock example, this is a stock example for how the hook checkout due works. It has a context of circlib, meaning when an item is overdue, the notices are fired off and based on the circulation library of the item rather than the owning of the owner of the item, because sometimes those could be different if you're in a large consortium that passes books around or passes items around. It's looking for all items that have not been checked in. The check-in time is null or non-existent, and the stop fines is either set to max fines because the item hit the fines cap, or it's empty, meaning it's still accruing fines, or there's no fines. But that's the parameters for the checkout due hook that most folks will use for their overdues. Now go to the next slide for me. Now we can hijack those hooks and change the rules for what they do, and we do it by creating our very own JSON file, putting it down in the server, and specifying it in our cron running for that particular one. So in this example, I've modified the checkout due hook. I've added in the long overdue items and the claims return items to that list of circulations that qualify for that hook. Now, I don't think a lot of folks would want claims returned notices to go to for overdues, but I've thrown it in here just to show how it can be done. So you can see I've modified that code. So it's going to do those 3 statuses for circulations, and they're all going to get overdue notices. So next slide, Rogan. Now, this is an example of how you could add items with a specific circ modifier to the trigger. You can see in the second subset, I've added things like bestseller or DVD, among other things, making it so that the item has to have one of those circ modifiers in order for it to qualify for the checkout due hook. Now, I think it's important that you don't want to go overboard with these kind of filters because they'll be hard to keep track of. It's all done on a file, and this is the file you're looking at right here. If you were just to grab that code, put it in a file named whatever you want, typically we name them .json, JSON. As long as we call this file with the triggers, it's going to process this and know what to do with it, and it's going to overwrite what the stock checkout do does. This is going to be our new checkout do for that trigger. So go ahead and that one right there, you can see that I've added in the profile. So in this particular one, this notice will only go to users that are in profile group 34, 35, or 36. And those IDs, of course, correspond with the name of a profile group that you would see on the front end. So
I'll just throw in real quickly. This is one of the most common uses I use filters for, because it's not infrequent that, for example, homebound patrons may be excluded from certain notices and things like that.
Yes, Michelle. Using a custom filter is basically providing a new rules for our hooks. So this hook checkout do will basically hijack the original checkout do that I showed in the original stock, what Evergreen uses naturally, and use this instead.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a custom hook though, because you still have to use one of the built-in hooks, but it modifies the behavior, like Steve said, of it.
Yep.
Okay. Next.
Yep, next slide. So in this example, I'm basically doing the same thing, but I've added in. Now I got ahead of myself. So this is just an example of how to do it based on a circ modifier and the circulation library. So I'm getting a little more, adding a little more stuff into it. And again, it's not something we commonly would do, but it's available if you have a situation that needs this.
Jennifer Pringle asks, so it will apply to all notices using that hook, so you can't easily customize per library. Not exactly, no. Jason's already anticipated what I was going to say. The filter has to be specified on the command line in cron. You can apply filters per cron call. So if you have a cron entry that says we're running granularity daily email, and you can apply that filter for that running in cron. That doesn't mean it's going to apply necessarily to all overdues, but it will apply to the overdue notices you're calling on that line in cron.
Yeah, if you provide the filter in the cron running for that granularity, it's going to use your custom filter. Everyone that you don't provide a custom filter for will fall back on the stock filters.
Right.
So
in that case, Jennifer, if you want to customize filters per library, there are a couple of ways you can go about it. One of which is to use granularities to break things out for different libraries. I don't think that's the way I would personally go, but for a comprehensive answer, we'd probably want to talk about the specifics of why you want them customized per library and what the best approach is.
Yeah, this was the jumbo one, so it's on 2 pages. So you see also I did the profile in the end. Now, I don't think I've ever actually put one of these into play live. I think this is more of something I've written up just so that it can be done. But I think that if you were to do this, it would have to be a case where you just want this notice to go to these folks and you don't have any other of the same type of notice that you want to go anywhere else. For example, you wouldn't want to use this to have this notice to go to profile 34 and then the same version of it to go to everybody who's not 34. Otherwise, you're going to have to make a separate filter for that as well. It starts to get really messy. So go ahead. Yeah. So I talk a little bit about it here. So filters are good for creating notice for a specific thing rather than everything. Keep in mind that if you have an overdue notice and you want different wording on it based on if the item is a book or a DVD or for a patron versus staff member, then using a filter is not the best way to go about it. It's really not. If you had a filter for this, such as for DVDs, you would then also need a second filter to say everything but DVDs. So that's not the most common thing I see using for filters is someone that has their DVDs. They have a trigger to mark their items lost at maybe 60 days. And maybe you want your DVDs to go lost at 7 days instead. So a filter is a way to run that trigger, or to run one and say, okay, if the circ modifier is a DVD, we'll go ahead and mark those lost when it's 7 days. If not, we'll wait for the 30-day running and mark those as lost. So it's a way to do something like that, because the notices, they don't have a way to identify by circ modifier. The only way to do that is in the filters. The notices will just look for everything that's overdue by the patron. It doesn't care what it is. And so the filter is a way to make it more specific and say, okay, only DVDs for this though. So if you have a situation where you want maybe different text, different wording, and Rogan touched on it a little bit earlier with the if statements, then if statements are absolutely the best way to do this. If you want to go to my next slide, Rogan.
Sure.
I've given a couple examples here. So the top one is showing you an if statement based on the profile of the user, where if the user profile is 6 or 7, whichever that lines up with on your system for whatever profile you're looking for, it's going to do the top text. Then everybody else, it's going to do the bottom text. Same thing with down below. If the library short name is library A, library B, or library C, they're going to get that text at the top. And if it's not, it's going to go fall into the else. And you can also add else ifs in here. So you can have a number of, you can have if a library A, if it's library A, then do this text. Else if it's library B, do this text. Else if it's library C, do this text. And then always have an else at the end to cover everything else that it didn't qualify. So this is the absolute best way to condense your notices into maybe one. If it's too much to do of course some consortium level notice, then I would recommend doing a system level notice and have some if statements in for the individual libraries. Not every library is going to want their own text, but the couple that do, use an if statement to change it for them, and rather than making a notice for every branch, because it can get out of control and very hard to manage really fast if you start spreading them out. And it's a lot of redundancy in the code. Doesn't really need to be there. We can just have, because a lot of the other things on a notice typically are going to be the same: the due date, the title, and the stuff folks want. It's usually the messaging that they want different, and it's not always everybody, but this is a good way to give everybody a different messaging while keeping the same notice, so you don't have to have 50 notices on your system for 50 notices for 7-day overdues and another 50 for 14 overdues. So it could just steamroll into a lot of notices. So
I'm going to interject real quickly to say I completely agree. It's better to do it in template if you can, rather than doing a notice, an action trigger for it. But I am going to say, I'm going to go back and use one of your slides, Steve, as examples. Mm-hmm. If there's anyone here that does have a situation where the JSON filter is the best way to go, and you're not comfortable with JSON and this looks cryptic, there's some good news. JSON is very widely used in the computing world. There's tons of resources out there about it, books. I've not checked, but I'm sure there's YouTube content for it if you're more of a video learner. There's tons of tools out there for helping construct JSON. So it is not an obscure thing at all. There's tons of resources for learning JSON. And I was just checking the wiki while Steve was chatting, and I don't see that we have an examples page for filters. So if we don't, and somebody wants to lead up that effort, that'd be great. I would heartily encourage somebody picking that up as a community project.
Back up a couple more slides there, Rogan.
Sure.
I listed the, go one more, I think. Oh, one more. Yeah, did I not list it there? I thought I listed the, Evergreen has a stock filter file that can be, you can grab it and you could just make modifications to. I thought right there
it is.
Yeah. So in the examples, there's an action trigger filters JSON example file that has a list of a number of hooks that are used in Evergreen. And so what I have done is I just yanked that checkout do section out of it. And you can do that with any of the hooks that are in there. And you can then just, rather than having to do the whole JSON from scratch, you can just copy that and make your modifications to it the same way I've done below. And it doesn't have to, if you're making a filter for the checkout do hook, it doesn't, and you'll notice in the filters example file has checkout due, it might have expire AU, it has a whole bunch of different hooks. You only need to have the hook that you're specifically trying to modify in it. So go down one more example, Rogan.
Back or forward?
Forward.
Okay.
One more. So in this example, this even though the stock filter file has all the hooks, my one for my checkout due that I'm calling from my action trigger runner just has this. This is the whole file right here. All I care about is the one hook that I'm modifying. So this is all that you have to do. You could basically cut this whole section here, paste it into a file, call it from your action trigger runner, and it'll use it. So that's the best way to do, is kind of modify what's already out there and tweak it to how you need it. But my other examples also show you can go crazy with it. You can JSON is very robust. You can find a lot of stuff with it, but I recommend against that if possible, to try to keep it as simple as can be.
Yeah, you can create landmines for future you to run into.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I'm going to sort of pause here before we get into troubleshooting. Elizabeth asks, can you share the link to filters? Do you mean the sort of stock filters that come with the distribution, Elizabeth? Or let's see. I don't have the Git repo up in front of me right now. Somebody can probably beat me to it. Oh, it was on the slide. Oh, that one. Okay. Sorry, I thought you were asking for a web link to the web Git instance, not the path. Jason Stevenson notes, sometimes it's a trade-off of filters versus multiple events and granularities. Absolutely. There's no absolute answer. You have to look at what makes best sense in your situation, and look at what makes sense for what's easier to maintain, and operationally what makes sense for your service goals on your server. Steve alluded to this earlier, but people don't want to receive text messages at 2 a.m. That kind of thing. Any other questions before we move on to a little bit about troubleshooting, and where we're going to talk a little bit more about events and things like that a little bit too? Giving a pause. Okay. Well, feel free to come in with questions at any point. I'm going to talk a little bit about some things I do for troubleshooting next. As I said, I do migrations a lot, so I set up a lot of new notices. Jennifer asks, for granularity, can you group based on org units? Thinking about multiple time zones. So yeah, you can. Granularities are arbitrary, so you can make up whatever makes sense for you. Just make sure that what you put in the field for granularity matches what's being run by cron on the server. So I set up lots of notices, and as I discussed, there was a learning curve. Notices can be sensitive. It is easy when you're editing notices to make a small mistake and it not be evident visually until you start digging. So I think it's important when setting up notices to monitor how they're doing and find ways to troubleshoot them. So I'm going to provide a couple of SQL queries for that. Now, this does kind of leave out people from the staff client, unfortunately. I would love to see the staff client have better tools for troubleshooting notices and action triggers. I'm not sure what those would look like right now, but I will share with you some of what I do. Jason Stevenson says, events have an org unit field. You can combine multiple events via granularity. Absolutely. And I didn't talk about the org unit field, but that's basically kind of the scope of where the events will process for. So in the case of, like, say, an overdue notice, it is that org and descendants where those circulations take place. Oops. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is this big blob of SQL. This is something I do to get a overview of where notices are, how they're performing, what their status is. And I'll break down some of the logic in here a little bit for you. I will point out that where it says foo here, short name equals foo, that's where you can put in a library system, a branch, a consortium, whatever short name of the Oregon descendants you want to look at the notices for. Now, I don't usually run this exactly as it looks here. It is not, I usually will do some modifications. I may say, add into this where statement where reactor equals process template, if I'm only looking at print notices. If there's a whole bunch of notices, I may only look at those in a certain range. But this is the basis that I use and then modify from frequently. And what this gives me is a list to tell me what the granularities are for the triggers, what state events are in. Now, we haven't talked a lot about events yet, and I was waiting for this to do so. Action triggers are obviously the thing that takes a hook and reacts to it and creates something. Events are the individual events run by the action trigger. So if you have something that creates a pending event, this may be done because it is one type and you've run the cron job and it's in an early state and it's created a pending event. Or if it's something that, like Steve was talking about, is baked into the system and created immediately, it may be from that. But at some point, you have a state and event in a state of pending. And that event is going to be a particular notice in this case. So this book is overdue, and it is being created from an action trigger for an email overdue notice. There's an event for that overdue. Now, then it goes from pending into being processed. And from there, it could go into a number of different states. It could be marked invalid. Invalid means, say, for that overdue notice, probably that the item's been checked back in and it's no longer overdue. Invalid is nothing scary. It could be marked complete, which means it's done. And you should have template output for it. It could be an error. Now, if it's an error, then you can, instead of looking at and we'll talk more about this in a second, you can go look at that error in the database and see why it errored. However, you can also have it complete, but have no output, which is why there's a special case down here for looking at when the data length is 0 and then it says Z. Because when I see something like an email or a native SMS going to an SMS gateway or a process template, and I see the length is 0, or it's very, very short, then I know something has gone wrong. And I need to go digging. Now, one of those places to go look can be the OpenSurf logs and see what it says. And those errors can often be very illustrative. But another thing you can do is look at what is in the output table of the database. And these are just some simple type queries I use to do that. I do like to look at template output, and I replace this event def with whatever the ID of the event definition is, just to make sure the template output looks good. And if I need to look at the errors, I can use this second query. I've never actually done so, but I imagine these can be accessed from the reporter as well. Does anybody know offhand in chat if the output table is linked through the field mapper for the reporter? I've not actually checked. While I'm waiting to see if anybody has a response on that, I'm going to give you a little bonus here. This is going outside Evergreen a bit, but I often have people ask about, okay, so you generate a template, but how does that become a PDF for a print notice? Well, that actually happens outside Evergreen. I mentioned earlier that we usually generate XML as the as the template output for our print notices. And the way that workflow works is that we actually have a cron job usually, and I'm saying we in the Evergreen community here, but it's not universal. You can do other things. And a cron job that runs something like a script that does a SQL query, gathers together that XML output, stores it, and then calls an XSLT processor with an associated XSL style sheet that then generates the PDF files. So that's technically not Evergreen, but it is the workflow that I see most commonly used in the Evergreen community. Again, if you wanted to directly generate HTML and print HTML or Markdown, or again, if you really have personal issues you need to resolve, LaTeX, you could do these things. And that brings us, we are right where I hope to be at this point. I hope to be about 220 to 230, so we're right in the middle of that. Jason Stevenson is saying LaTeX for the win. I actually like LaTeX, but I'm not going to try to use it for this purpose personally. So we have some time for Q&A before people need to move on to the next session. So the floor is everyone's. Sure, Jason wants to talk a little bit about filters and granularities. Go for it. I think you can ask to share, speak, and Gina can approve you.
Am I there yet? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So going back to Jennifer's question about splitting up events by org units, there's two approaches. I recently had to make a decision between the two. One of the more obvious ways to do it, each event, I think it's each event definition has an org unit field associated with it, and that's like the org unit that it'll fire for. So you can make, if you have one that's consortium wide and you want to split it up, you can create one for, say, every system in your, in your org unit tree, and then you can give those granularities. So if you say had, I don't know, 5 or 6 systems, now you probably have more, but let's just say, for sake of example, you have 5 or 6 systems, say 2 are in one time zone, 4 in the other, and you want to run them by time zone. You then give, say, a granularity for those time zones to the 2 that are in time zone A, and then a different granularity for the 4 that are in time zone B. Then you set up your action triggers to run those granularities at the appropriate times. What we recently encountered an issue where we basically combined our pre-do and auto-renew notices into one notice. Because what I discovered was the auto-renew basically does everything pre-do does if you reword your template a bit. Because the auto-renew will go through, try to auto-renew everything. It'll say I renewed these, but I couldn't renew these. And so if you run that at the same time you run your pre-dos and you reword your template a little bit, it'll do both jobs basically. And we process anywhere from, say, 14,000 to 38,000 of those every day. And when we were trying to run them all at the same time, they'd run for 4 or 5 hours. Half of them would blow up sometimes. Sunday before a Monday holiday, because we were 2 days out, was awful because everything was due on that Tuesday. That's when we get the 38 to 40,000 of them. So the options I was looking at was splitting them up into about 100 and some different events with 12 granularities, or writing 12 different filter files. And so I actually chose to do the latter. I wrote 12 filters. Inside my filters, there's a subquery Steve had an earlier example where in the thing it was like the user ID was in a select statement inside the filter. We did something very similar, but we did where the home OU for the user, the patron, was in a list with IDs for the ones that we want to run at that time period. So now what we're doing is we basically have 12 set up to run once every 2 hours. And each one uses a different custom filter that's named for the time. So it's like we named them daily PD2-0030 for 12:30 midnight, 0230 for 2:30 a.m., and so on all the way till 22:30 for the 10:30 that night. And it works really well. We do maybe 1,400 to 2,000 every 2 hours. They take about 45 minutes to get through the initial events. The notices sometimes take a little longer to get sent, but they're handled by the regular run pending, because basically the auto renew event does the auto renewal and then creates a new event to send a notice to the patrons. And and by grouping them by the user's home library, we kind of guaranteed that the user only gets one notice a day instead of, because if you have a user, if you go by the checkout library, that is the circlib on the circulation, and you have a user that uses 2 or 3 different libraries, they might get 2 or 3 different notices in a day. So there's an example of like the trade-off between, do we want to do granularities or do we want to do filters? And in my case, I opted for filters because I was going to have hundreds of events and still have 12 granularities, or I could just have the one event and 12 filters. But you have to kind of decide in your own case. Like if you have hundreds of locations, you might want to try the filter approach, or you might find that creating the events for each org unit. Yeah, that's exactly what Elizabeth Davis asked, can you use the same setup for auto renew and courtesy emails? That's exactly what we're using it for, is the auto renew and courtesies. We combined them into one event because the auto renew basically does the courtesy notice if you change the wording of your template to reflect that. And then, yeah, that's exactly what we're using it for. That's all right. I missed something Rogan said earlier too, so easy to do. And we did a similar thing in COVID, because all of our libraries closed, and then some opened a bit over time. So we had a consortium-wide notices for about everything. But we turned all those off, and then we just started adding notices for individual libraries as they were opening up again. And so that made it easy to just give notices for libraries that were open, and the libraries that weren't, we weren't sending notices out for. And then once, I don't know, 3/4 or basically all of our libraries were open again, we turned off those per library notices and then turned on the consortium-wide ones again. And in that case, it was just we used the same filter and same granularity. We just created individual events for libraries. So I hope that clarified what I was saying in chat earlier, because I realized what I was saying may have been a little vague.
No, that's good. Thank you, Jason.
Okay.
And yeah, and just to repeat something you said for everybody, there's no universal answer about exactly how to set up owner versus filter and granularity. These are tools that are in the toolbox, but you always have to look at your situation to see what's the best one. I know that's something that Steve and I chat about periodically, especially as, libraries grow with more and more members, and, situations change over time. Are the decisions that were made years ago still the right solution? So, like anything else, it's probably worth revisiting if you haven't in a long time.
And that's a really good point about libraries joining, because we've had several members join, and we're going to have another one join very soon. And what I think, and I may want to revisit my choice about using filters, because every time we get a new member, I have to decide which filter to add them to. and then I have to manually edit the filter and put it where our host can put it up on our utility server.
Yeah.
So that's a thing. Whereas if we do it with different events, I could just someone could go in the client and create the new event for the new member library and add them to the appropriate granularity, which that might be easier maintenance in the long run. So there's also things like that to consider too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions, discussion? Elizabeth, so how early to auto renew?
That depends.
I feel like that's sort of like, what is the sound of one hand clapping?
We do 2 days. But
I usually see 3 days, but 2-3 days I think is kind of the sweet spot.
And ours is actually, I think its delay is -2 and our max delay is -3, or maybe I have that backwards.
Yeah.
I could probably just look it up.
And do be careful if you're doing auto renews and pre-overdue courtesy notices to make sure if you're running them, if they're separate entities for you, that they don't overlap. I generally prefer to run auto renews before pre-overdues so that if they get renewed, the pre-overdue doesn't run.
I want to throw out there something that Jason had said a moment ago about he had noticed the auto renews erroring. I have seen this. If you have a lot of them, we're talking thousands, maybe 10,000s more a day that are running. You definitely do not want to run the auto renew process at the same time as things like marking the items as lost and those kind of processes. You probably should run it on its own by itself, because the process for checking if an item is able to be auto renewed takes a little bit of time on the server side, and it eats up a trigger drone. And what I've seen is if too many of those get eaten up because other triggers are also running at the same time and the auto renew doesn't have one available to it, it'll move on and cause that one to error. So what will happen is by the end of the morning, you might have 10,000 successful auto renewals and maybe 1,000 errors that doesn't look like they should have errored. And when you reset them, all of a sudden they're working, but it's because the system just ran out of time to do that. And so we try to keep those very isolated. And it sounds like your workaround was to split them out using filters, and that works too. I've had a lot of success basically isolating the run on large batches without doing anything else. Most notably, the mark item loss is another thing that has to take an action, and that takes up time too. So the two of those will fight with each other. And so separating them is a lot easier. And to answer Elizabeth's question about when to run them, now the auto renew notice was initially made to take the place of the courtesy notice. That's why it has two items in there. One that kind of it kind of has the text of a pre-due, and also it also let the patron know if it was a success or not a success. So it is meant to take the place. And what I've seen, I'm not sure when it entered Evergreen. I have to research it, but now on the circ modifiers, you can, not the circ modifiers, the policies that dictate how long an item is going to be checked out, and the fines and whatnot. On those policies, you can set a flag on there to tell it if this item is renewed early, to go ahead and extend the due date by the amount of days that it was auto renewed. That way, we don't have to wait to the last minute to do an auto renew. You don't have to wait to the day it was due to do an auto renew in order to get the full length of the circulation. You can have it go 3 days early and give you a 3-day window in case there is a problem. And it'll send a notice out. And what it'll do is it'll extend the due date of that renewal and add on the extra 3 days that would have been missed because you auto renewed it early. So that's an option to do as well without having to worry about trying to auto renew these at the very last minute.
And I do encourage people to use that circulation policy feature. I think this is just my personal opinion, does not reflect the company I work for or any jazz like that. I think it's just good customer service. And yeah, there is an additional challenge there, obviously, for consortia. As Steve said, auto renew was meant to kind of provide a more comprehensive solution to the pre-overdue, but a lot of libraries were already using pre-overdue, and then auto renew came in existence. And when you're coordinating for 50 libraries, it's a very different beast than just one library. But it may be a project that you may want to undertake and make things simpler for yourselves and patrons and libraries.
So,
Jennifer asks, Jason, do you allow additional manual renewals or just auto renewals?
yeah, we still allow manual renewals. Patrons can renew through the OPAC. Staff can renew for patrons. Staff can override, of course, if they think it's appropriate. Um, so the wording in our auto renewals is essentially we kind of took a little bit of language from the old pre-overdues and added it in there, and then just we used it as a replacement for the pre-due notices because it works really well if you do it. We're doing it at the same interval. In fact, that I mentioned the granularity was daily PD2, and the PD was for pre-due notifications when it was originally set up. So it basically takes their place if you run it at the same interval. We do have some types that allow manual renewals but don't allow auto renewals. Those are rare, but there's a couple of things. I can't think of what they are off the top of my head, and I think it even varies by some libraries. I think we have 1 or 2 libraries that don't allow auto renewals on, say, DVDs or something like that, but they can manually renew it one time. So the patron will get a notice that those items could not be renewed, but they could contact their library or whatever the verbiage is.
Jennifer says, we have a number of libraries with items with no renewals or just manuals.
Yeah, you could probably, in the case of just manual renewals, you could probably add some code in a template to say if there's renewals remaining but no auto renewal. You could add language to say you can renew this yourself online with a link. I think we might. I haven't looked at our template in a while, but that might have been one of the things we did to the auto renew notification. We provided. I think we do have a link to the OPAC where they can renew.
Yeah. But if you do look at, just to expand on that point a little bit more, if you look at getting rid of pre-overdues and just using auto renewals, that is a factor you're going to have to think about any items that don't use auto renewals and how you're going to handle that. Okay. We still have a little bit of time. Any more discussion or questions? Well, I will continue to hang out here for a bit if people want to chat at all, but we do have some more presentations coming up, and some people may want to, get some fresh tea or coffee or whatever before the next ones. So I will not hold you if you want to run away. Not that I could anyway. You have free will.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming and listening to us talk about this. I appreciate everybody showing up, and thank you.
Yeah, I hope that was useful. If anybody has constructive feedback, be glad to take it. We may, pull this out of the storage drawer to use again at some future event. And if you have any feedback about additional things you would have liked to have seen, it'd be useful to know. Yeah. I hope everyone has a great conference.
Thank you, Rogan and Steve. So with the end of that, we have a break into the next presentation that will start at 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central, and 12:30 Pacific, which is building a better reporter through community collaboration. So if anyone wants to take and yes, links to the slides will be available at some point, Jeff. Not only will the slides be posted to the website, but we'll also have recordings of all the presentations throughout the conference, with the exception of any interest groups and lightning talks. They'll be happening at the regular conference. So we will be bugging people for those slides at some point.
Yeah, and timing of the videos will be just dependent on when we have an opportunity to get them out of Ring Central and get them uploaded, but in the next few weeks.
Okay, did anyone have any last minute questions before we officially take our break? Just many thank yous. Okay. So I'm just going to share the next slide and hang out in here for now. Thank you again, everyone. It's always nice to have these presentations, especially since pre-conference is always a little bit tougher since you have to come up with like a lot of content for like a 2-hour presentation. But I was happy that you're able to all get through your materials with a good time.
Yeah, we could have done 4 hours on this.
I believe it.
Michelle says heads would likely explode. Either that or people would gain their cure for insomnia. One of the two.